let me turn on the laser pointer. Just a minute. Yeah. Okay, so we can start now. Hello all of you. Good evening. Welcome back to another live problem solving session for this course, Introduction to Semiconductor Devices, which is being conducted by Professor Naresh from IIT Hyderabad. I am Soham Lakote, currently a fourth year PhD student at IISc Bangalore, working under Professor Gaurav Banerjee in the area of FMCW radars on chip. So now in the last class I had given you the complete overview of the semiconductor industry, and in the end we had just solved few problems, right? So now this time we will have some insightful session, but it won't be that long because we have some problems to solve in this session, right? So now what I have observed in the forum that people are still asking a lot of doubts regarding the orbitals, shells, why the energy bands splitted and all. So what I will do, I have some pictures with me, so we will go through them and we will understand very deeply what are the shells, subshells, orbitals, and why the energy bands splitted. We won't try to understand from the wave function point of view because the sir has explained that concept in very depth, right? He has taken the Schrodinger's equation. He has told you that when the two wave functions interact, then their energy levels has to split up, and that is the reason why the energy band when the two atoms come close together, why the band splitting starts to occur, right? So we will try to understand it from a different point of view. It will be based on the school physics and chemistry classes that you had taken in your school and 11th and 12th class, right? So now let's start the session. So this will be the organization of the session. We will have a session for 50-60 minutes. After that we will take a break for around 5 to 10 minutes, and after that we will resume the session, right? So just for the sake of information, since few people will be new here, so all the recordings of this session along with the lecture slides will be uploaded to this YouTube channel, and I have already copy pasted the link in the chat box. If you don't have the link with you, then just remind me to copy paste this link once again in the break that we will be taking in between the session, right? And yeah, so let's start the session. Let's look into what are these shells, subshells, orbitals and orbits, right? So now first of all, you must have seen that there is an energy level associated with an electron. Let me turn on the pen just for a better understanding. Yeah, so you must have seen this formula in your high school physics or in your 11th and class 12th standard. If you are not familiar with this formula, then you must be familiar with at least this formula. All of you must have prepared for the state CETs or JEE exam or JEE advanced exam, right? So you must have seen this formula. Now it is telling you the energy level of an electron, and N is basically we are calculating the first few energy levels. So for N is equal to 1, you will get one energy level. For N is equal to 2, you will get another energy level. And as N is increasing, you are moving away, right? You are moving away from the nucleus. Moving away from the nucleus, right? So now what is actually happening? As you can see, as I am increasing the N, this energy is becoming less negative, right? So this energy is becoming less negative. Now what does this negative sign means? So this negative sign means that how tightly the electron is actually bound to the nucleus. The more the negative the number, higher the tighter is the bounding of that electron with respect to the nucleus. So that's why this N is equal to 1. This is the shell which is very close to the electron, and that is why it will be having the highest bounding for that particular electron, right? For N is equal to 3, the number is less negative, almost 13 times less negative, right? So that means that this electron is not as tightly bound compared to the electron in N is equal to 1 shell, right? So you just need to understand that this less negative means that electron is actually loosely bound. And if you want to understand it, then I have drawn some shells over here. So this is the nucleus that you have. There exists protons over here, right? And these are your K, L, M, N shells that you must have studied in the high school physics, right? So now this negative number, it is again the same thing, right? So for K's shell, the binding energy is the highest because this E1 is very negative, right? And for the N shell, the binding energy is the lowest because you can see this negative number has decreased a lot, almost 13 times, right? So this is the first thing that I want you to understand, right? So now let's move on to the next thing, and that is the orbit versus orbital. So now you must have seen in the high school physics that you must have studied that electron revolves around the nucleus in some trajectory, maybe circular, maybe elliptical, whatever you must have been told, right? But now we are saying that actually electron does not revolve like that. This path is not at all circular, and electron does not revolve like that. Now what the hell is happening now exactly? So now first of all, we must understand that what has changed from the left diagram to the right diagram over here, right? So in high school physics, you didn't study the Schrodinger's equation, you didn't had the concept of the wave function, right? Now what has happened over here, sir must have told you that when the dimensions of interest, right, they become very close to the de Broglie wavelength, right? When the dimensions of interest become very comparable to the de Broglie wavelength, you cannot ignore the quantum effects that are arising in the system, right? You had not studied the quantum effects in your high school physics and not even in the class 11th or 12th, right? So now, right now, since you guys are being introduced to the Schrodinger's equation, you guys know what the wave function actually is. So now, since the dimensions of the interest are very comparable to the de Broglie wavelength, we have to take into account the quantum effects, right? And the first thing that you should remember is the Heisenberg's principle, right? Correct? H by 2. So now what does this tell you? That you cannot accurately determine the position of an electron. You cannot accurately locate the electron, that electron exists in this particular point, because the electron is not a particle anymore. It also exhibits a wave-like nature, right? So now instead of determining the positions and other parameters of the electrons very accurately, we assign the probabilities and we just tell them that okay, these orbits are not existing anymore, but there will be some region in the near the nucleus where there is a high probability of electron to exist over there compared to rest of the points in near the nucleus, right? So what I'm telling you, like there will be some region around the nucleus over here, like over here somewhere. I'm not drawing the exact shape. In these points, there is a high probability that electron will exist compared to other points near the nucleus. So this is what we got from the wave function, right? When you introduce the wave function. Now, for which cases you will take the orbit? So just take an example of the Earth revolving around the sun, right? Earth revolving around the sun. Now the dimensions of interest are pretty huge compared to the de Broglie wavelength, right? So that is why you can accurately predict that let's say in the year 2033, at this particular date, what will be the location of the Earth with respect to sun, because it is actually it is revolving around the sun in a particular orbit, right? Elliptical orbit, correct? We actually exactly can predict about it, because the de Broglie wavelength it is very small compared to the dimensions of interest over here, right? But this is not the same case for the electron which is revolving around the nucleus, because dimensions of interest have shrunk a lot, right? So what are the orbitals exactly? So the orbitals are nothing but these are the points around the nucleus where there is a 90% probability of electron to exist, right? So they are nothing but they are just some points in the space, not even the continuous contour. See, this is the continuous contour, right? This is a continuous contour. What I am telling you, these are just the points that are existing in the space, right? And how are you going to get this point? I will explain you in the next slides, right? So just remember that these are just the cloud points, and at any given point in the time, electron can be present in one of these points or many of these points because of the wave function nature, right? And there is a 90% probability of that thing happening, correct? So now how these shapes are actually derived, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time over here, but if you are a mathematics enthusiast, then these are the Schrodinger's equation, and these are just for the hydrogen atom. Just look over here. So you have to solve these equations. Maybe you can use the Python, maybe you can use the MATLAB. You have to solve these equations, and after solving these equations, you will get certain shapes, and those shapes will be nothing but the shapes of the orbitals. And orbitals are nothing but probability that electron will exist in this region, and the probability is equal to 90%, right? So now how the orbitals look exactly. So now I have taken the example of 2p orbitals over here. By the way, for all the images, the references are mentioned at the bottom. So you can go to these YouTube channels and watch their videos as well. So they have explained in very depth, right? So just a minute, somebody wants to join. Yeah. So now this spherical thing that you are seeing over here, right? So it is nothing but your 2s orbital. It is your 2s orbital. Inside it, they have not shown explicitly over here, but there will also exist a sphere of 1s orbital. And for the 2p, there are actually 6 slopes that you can see over here. So if I just consider this particular axis, maybe I can denote it like 2py, at this particular axis I can denote it maybe like 2px, right? 2px, and at this particular axis, along this axis, I can denote it like 2pz, right? So now why did we get three lobes like this, that is along three axes, and not for this s orbital? So now again the answer lies in this Schrodinger's equation. So for that particular p orbital, if you try to solve the Schrodinger's equation, then you will find that there exists, I'll just write it, there exist three solutions. What solution? Solutions in the space region, right? In space region near nucleus, right? So there exist three solutions for a particular energy level. For a particular energy level. Just a minute, somebody wants to join. Yeah, for a particular energy level, and that's why, since for each energy level there actually exists three solutions, that is why you are seeing that there are three main lobes. Actually 6 lobes are there, but if you just ignore the negative lobes, then 3 distinct lobes are actually existing, right? And what does this orbital say? The region that I'm drawing over here, there is a very low probability that electron will exist. It will exist at this particular point while having its motion around the nucleus. But if I look at this particular point, this blue one, right, then there exists a high probability that the electron will be occupying any of this point at given particular time, right? So that is what these orbitals are actually just telling you, right? So now if you actually go into very much depth, and if you see, then these were the point clouds that I was actually talking about. So these are not the continuous contours, as you can see over here. You can, of course, you can draw a particular curve around them, and you can approximate that electron will exist around this particular in this particular contour. But these are not the contours themselves. They are just the distinct points that we have got by solving the Schrodinger's equation, right? So this is what the orbital will actually look like, and these points that you are seeing, so these are the points where electron can be present at any particular given time, right? Again, it has been taken from the YouTube channel, because of course I cannot create this type of shell because I am not that much experienced in creating this type of visualizations, right? So now let's move into intuitive way of understanding the orbitals. So this is what you will get from the Schrodinger's equation. Another way to look at, to visualize this particular shape, is to, what you can do, so let's say this is the nucleus, and this black color thing that you are seeing over here, this black color thing, so this is the electron that is actually revolving around the nucleus, right? So now what we are doing over here, actually we are clicking almost lakhs of picture for this particular system. So this is my camera that I have over here, right? And I'm going to click lots of pictures, and what I will be doing, all these pictures I will be overlapping them on top of each other, and after that I will see what kind of diagram I will be getting. So this is what you are seeing over here. I'm taking multiple snapshots as I'm moving over here. I'm taking snapshots, multiple snapshots, and after taking snapshots for maybe a month or something like that, you can see the region which was blank over here, now it is filled with the points that you can see over here. So these black dots that you are seeing over here, so these are all the places where I was able to capture the electron, that electron actually existed in this particular points. And now if you try to approximate this shape, then you will get a sphere. You will get a sphere like this, right? You will get a sphere like this, and this is nothing but this is your 1s orbital. So this is the best way to actually visualize the orbital. If you don't want to go into the wave function, just keep on snapshotting the movement of the electron for a lot of time, and just overlap the points that you got. You will get a particular shape, and that shape will be the shape of the orbital that you will be having actually, right? So this was just one of the way. And now we will be moving on to the electronic configuration diagram. Now why I am telling you all this, because I just want to explain you a band splitting, right? I want to explain you the band splitting from a little bit different point of view, not from the wave function exactly, right? So you must have studied this electronic configuration diagram in your 11th, 10th, or even your high school physics, right? So if I just tell you, then all these things that you are seeing over here, all these dashed lines, so this dashed line represent an orbital. Each of the dashed line that you are seeing over here, it represents an orbital, and all of them have a particular energy on their own, right? So you can see 1s is here, 2s is here. So if you go higher, then they have, so it is an increasing order of energy, right? So this 6p orbital will be having a higher energy compared to this 2s orbital that is present over here, right? So within this if you compare within this 3s and 3p, this 3p is having, just a minute, somebody wants to join. Yeah, then this 3p is at the higher energy level. But if you look over here, the 4s, right? If you compare the 4s over here, then the 3d is actually having a higher energy compared to the 4s. So now how did this 3 actually jump in at a higher level compared to this 4s? Then you must have studied something called as, just a minute, this Aufbau principle, right? You must have studied this Aufbau principle, that this is the way you fill the electrons from lower to higher energy level. And so you can clearly see that 4s is actually lower compared to 3d over here. I'm just refreshing this high school physics that you had studied, right? So now this is how the electron configuration diagram looks like. And why is it so important for me? Because these are the outer sets. These outer sets that you are seeing over here, they will be the ones that will be interacting when 2 or 3 atoms are brought close to each other, right? So now let's look at, so now we will be looking at the s orbital over here. I just want you to visualize their shapes, right? So now this is the shape of the 1s orbital for the 2s, for 3s, for 4s. So you can see all of them are looking like a sphere, but the 4s is having a larger radius compared to the 1s, right? Now why did this happen? Because 1s can handle only 2 electrons, right? So s orbital can only handle the 2 electrons, right? So now since as I'm moving away from the nucleus, right? As I'm moving away from the nucleus, the energy is actually increasing. And why the energy is actually increasing? I just showed you this formula. Just a minute. I had just shown you this formula, right? So as n increases, the En number becomes less and less negative. And as En becomes less and less negative, that means that electron is loosely bound now to the nucleus compared to the inner shells, right? So now you must have understood that for the 4s, like since the electrons are having the higher energy, there is a good probability that in this sphere also they will be lying at the outer portion of the sphere rather than the inner portions of the sphere, right? Because these electrons are having the higher energy and they are loosely bound with respect to the nucleus, right? So this is how the shape of the s orbital is. Again, the p orbital I have already shown you, they will look like a dumbbell shape, right? And so they are present along the 3 perpendicular axes which I am showing over here. They are lying around the 3 perpendicular axes which I am showing over here, right? So now just remember these shapes and just know that something like this exists, that electron configuration diagram like this exists. And how this electron configuration diagram actually present? So we are actually following the 3 principle. So the first one is the Aufbau principle, the next one is the Pauli's exclusion, and the third one is the Hund's principle, right? So out of this, so this one is the most important that I will be using, right? So now this is the Pauli's exclusion principle, and what it tells you, only put 2 electrons in an orbital and make sure that their spins are opposite. So let's say I take this particular orbital, let's say this is 2pz, right? So the first rule that it is telling me that I can only put 2 electrons and that too with the opposite spin. So this is the correct configuration. I cannot have more than 2 electrons, right? I cannot have something like this. So this is the incorrect configuration, right? So I will be following this rule exclusively, and this rule has been, you must have studied in your high school physics as well, right? So again, I have just taken some images from the Google just to show you what I am just telling. You can refer to them later when you are studying this PPT, right? So now what is actually happening in the band splitting? So what I have done, I have brought 3 atoms very close with respect to each other, right? So now what has happened when these atoms were actually very far apart from each other, right? So let's say this atom was here, this atom was here, this atom was here. When they were not interacting with each other, so what does this mean? So this means that my dimensions of interest, my dimension of interest is actually larger than the de Broglie wavelength, right? And when the dimension of interest is larger than the de Broglie wavelength, I can actually ignore the quantum effects, right? So I can actually ignore the quantum effects and I don't have to think about the wave functions. Now as these atoms are brought closer to each other, then this 2p orbital, let's say this is 2px, 2py and 2pz, right? Now if these atoms are brought so close with respect to each other that these 2px orbitals of all 3 atoms start seeing each other, right? All 2px orbitals start seeing each other and they start to interact with respect to each other, right? So then we will apply the Pauli's exclusion principle, right? And what does this Pauli's exclusion principle tell? that, hey, look, you can only have, first of all, if I'm talking about 2px orbital, then you have a 2px orbital for this particular system over here, right, at this particular energy level. Now when you bring two of them very close to each other, right, then all of them are occurring at a same energy level. Let's say all of them are completely filled, all of them are completely filled, right. Now at this particular 2px, right, now I have total of 6 electrons, I have total of 6 electrons at this 2px orbital, right. And now what does this Pauli's exclusion principle say? It told you that no more, just a minute, somebody wants to join, no more than 2 electrons can occupy the same orbital. No more than 2 electrons can occupy the same orbital, and I am already having 6 electron in this particular orbital 2px, right. So this is a clear cut violation of the Pauli's exclusion principle, right. And I don't want to violate this principle because it works really well even when all the atoms are brought very close with respect to each other. Now to satisfy this Pauli's exclusion principle, what has to happen? The 2px levels that you are seeing over here, they have to split with respect to each other. Only when they are splitting with respect to each other, and if I fill the electrons like this, only then I can satisfy the Pauli's exclusion principle, right. Now this 2px is different compared to 2px2, and this is different compared to 2px3, right. So now instead of imagining it from a wave function point of view, if you are finding it difficult, you can also think about the band splitting from this point of view, that if I bring all the atoms very close with respect to each other, there will be a lots of electrons present in the same orbital, and that is not even allowed, right. So to satisfy that Pauli's exclusion principle, all these atoms which have been brought very close to each other and whose 2px orbital is like all of them are seeing the same 2px orbital, now their energy levels have to be split up to satisfy the Pauli's exclusion principle, right. So now I hope the doubts about the orbitals, why the band splitting actually happened, right, and what actually encouraged these orbitals to interact with each other. Now you may ask me one question, what about this 1s and 2s orbitals? So I will talk about the 1s first, right. So now I have told you that these are, just a minute, somebody wants to join, yeah. So I have told you that these 1s orbitals, right, 1s orbitals, they are very close to the nucleus. They are very much close to the nucleus compared to this 2p orbital, and when you bring two atoms very close with respect to each other, then the first interaction that will happen for the loosely bound electrons. And now from this formula itself, just a minute, yeah, from this formula itself we can easily say that for n is equal to 1 and n is equal to 2, then n is equal to 2 is loosely bound compared to the electrons present in n is equal to 1, right. So now if I go over here, that is 2p over here, right, then the electrons over here are loosely bound compared to the electrons present in the 1s, right. So that's why they don't take a part in the interaction. Only the loosely bound electrons can take the part in the interaction, right. So this is the reason why the electrons which are very close to the nucleus, they do not take the part in that interaction, because they are very tightly bound with respect to nucleus, right. So you have to overcome that force, the force with which the actually this electron is being bound to the nucleus. You have to actually overcome that force also if you want this electron to participate during this interaction. But this does not happen. Even when you bring two atoms very close, these 2p and 2s orbitals, they will be the first one that will take part in the interaction, right. And you have already understood why the band splitting occurred. So the first way to think about it is from the wave function point of view that the sir has taught, and the second one is to look it from the Pauli's exclusion principle. If I bring the three atoms very close, then in the same orbital now I have 6 electrons, which clearly violates the Pauli's exclusion principle. So I have to split these levels into 3 different levels so that the Pauli's exclusion principle is satisfied, right. I hope this point is very much clear to you. If you guys have still any more doubts, please ask me right now. I will be moving forward to the next topic, that is the EK diagram. So please feel free to unmute yourself if you guys have any doubt. I will just stop for a 1 minute over here. Any doubts? You guys understood what orbitals are and how the Pauli's exclusion principle yielded in the band splitting? Okay, great. So then let's move on to the next topic, that is the EK diagram, right? So now first of all we have to bring a motivation of why do I even need to study about this EK diagram, right? What is so wrong with this diagram that I need to go to the EK diagram? So this is your classic band splitting diagram, and after this you just draw a very simple diagram like this: EC, EV, and you have a EG over here. Now what is so wrong with this diagram? So now I will just like to give an analogy to you that whatever Wi-Fi signal that you are currently receiving, so many of you must be using your Wi-Fi from your home router, right? So now of course the signal that is coming, you can visualize it in a time domain also. There may be some kind of amplitude modulation or there may be some kind of phase modulation. Don't worry if you don't understand these terms, you will be studying these terms in depth when you go to your third year of engineering, right? So now this is the time domain signal. I mean, if I just observe the amplitude of the signal with respect to time, I will get a signal like this. But if I go into the frequency domain, then I can actually tell you that this signal contains only a 20 megahertz of bandwidth. That is, if I take the Fourier transform of this signal and I just plot it, right, I can just easily tell that all my signal information is contained within this particular region, right? Now what is so important about this? Because there is a particular bandwidth that has been assigned for this entire Wi-Fi region, and I have to divide this bandwidth. Among multiple users, right? Divide this bandwidth among multiple users. So the first of all, just by seeing this signal, I don't know what are the frequency contents of this signal. The moment I go into the other domain, that is the Fourier domain, I can tell that okay, this signal is actually only containing 20 megahertz of bandwidth. So now if this signal is containing only this 20 megahertz of bandwidth, this rest of the stuff is completely free and unoccupied. So I can actually assign this unused spectrum to different users. And I can only tell you this information by looking at this Fourier domain and not into this time domain, right? Similarly, if I take the transform and I transform this diagram into this EK, there are two things that I can actually tell you. The first one, whether the semiconductor is direct band gap or indirect band gap. And now you ask me, why is it so important to differentiate that semiconductor is direct band gap or indirect band gap? Then sir will be teaching you the concepts of LED and photodetector, and he will be talking about the efficiency of the photodetector, right? Efficiency of the photodetector. So just to give you an idea, if I shine a light on this semiconductor, right, then the electron from the valence band will get excited to the conduction band. But if these two minimas are not overlapped, right? Just a minute. Yeah. If the maxima of the valence band and the minima of the conduction band, if they are not overlapped, then this electron has to perform two motions. It has to go vertically, it has to go horizontally, and the probability of this happening is very low, right? So the efficiency of photodetector actually degrades a lot if you use a silicon, that is the indirect band gap semiconductor, compared to the direct band gap semiconductor like gallium arsenide or others, right? So this is the first reason why EK diagram is important. The second reason why EK diagrams are so important, because from the curvature of the EK diagram, it tells you it gives you the effective mass. Now sir must have told you the effective mass. What is this effective mass? So from the classical mechanics, you know F is equal to ma, but this does not hold true anymore for the quantum mechanical effects, because of the quantum mechanical effects arising in the crystal, right? Now what we do, we modified this M and we told you that M star A, this will hold valid. And now why this will hold, why this equation is valid? Because of the movement of the electron in the crystal, considering the wave function and all, considering the Kronecker model, that is the electrons movement in the potential well, considering the atom as a 3D potential well, and if you calculate the movement of electron, if electrons wants to pass in the crystal, then considering all this effect, you will get a one concept, that you will get this EK diagram, and from this EK diagram actually you will be able to calculate the effective mass. Now this effective mass takes into account all the quantum mechanical effects that are arising in the system, and that's why we told you that F is equal to M star A, this equation will hold true, right? So Now after getting this effective mass, I can start applying this equation, right? And I can start treating the system as a quantum, instead of taking all other quantum mechanical effects, I can just start using this equation even in this system, because I have taken all effects into account, right? So these were the two important reasons why actually we moved to the EK diagram, because this information was not clearly visible in from this particular diagram, because on the x-axis you just have a distance over here, and on the y-axis you have an energy, right? So I needed this EK diagrams to get two things. The first one, of course, to identify the direct and indirect band gap, and the second one is to get to this concept of the effective mass, right? And why is this effective mass so important? Because this effective mass actually tells me the ease with which electron can actually move in the crystal, right? So let's say I have a semiconductor crystal, and this is the electron, and I have another semiconductor crystal, right? So if the electron is able to move very easily in this crystal compared to this crystal, right? So that means that if I apply some signal, let's say a AC signal across this semiconductor slab, that means if electron is able to quickly respond, since it does not face a lot of disturbance while moving, it is not facing any hindrance, that means if I apply a very high frequency signal also, electron will be able to perturb according to this signal, right? So whatever change is happening over here, this change will be getting reflected across this semiconductor slab. But if my electron is moving very slowly, if it is moving very slowly in the crystal, and if I apply a high frequency signal, then what is the problem? Then the problem is this, whatever changes I will be able to observe, they won't be in line with the high frequency signal, because this electron is not able to respond to the change very quickly. So this is the application of the EK diagram from the circuit guy's point of view, right? So we will always think of, okay, you have taught me one concept, just relate it with the circuit's application, because if you try to tell me from a very quantum mechanical point of view, I may get bored and I may not be even interested in the subject. But if you tell me from the practical point of view, of course this concept will become a lot clearer, and actually you will be having an interest to study the concept, right? So we will look into this. I have some slides, we will look into what is actually happening over here. So I hope the importance of the EK diagram is very much clear to you. And just remember this formula, because we will be solving few numericals based on this formula now. Just give me a moment. Yeah. So now, analogy is also clear. So now one last point before we start solving the numerical. The first question that many of the guys who are not even interested in the subject ask, what did you get out of your engineering after studying this Schrodinger's equation? Where are you using this in your real life? Just tell me that. Most of the guys who go into the non-core jobs like banking, consulting and all, so they will always ask you this question: what did you get out of your engineering? Why did you study that calculus and all? Why did you study the Schrodinger's equation in the first place? Just tell me that, right? So now I will just give you one flow. You can derive rest of the flow. I will just tell you one complete flow just to tell you how we can reach from the Schrodinger's equation to the I-flow, right? So now you have a Schrodinger's equation, right? Schrodinger gave you the wave function of the particle, that is your electron. He told you that when the de Broglie wavelength is now very much comparable to the dimensions of the interest, you just cannot treat the particle as a particle. It has the wave-like nature also, right? Now to understand the behavior of that particle, that is the wave-like nature, we studied the concept of electron in a potential well, finite potential well, infinite potential well, whatever you can tell. Then we extended this concept and we told that, okay, in a crystal a lot of atoms exist, so around each atom I have this potential well, right? Now I have to calculate the motion of the electron when it passes through a periodic potential well, right? I got that motion also. I solved the Kronecker model. I got the EK diagram, right? I got the EK diagram from the Kronecker model, and from this EK diagram I actually observed two things. There exists a band gap in the semiconductor, and from the curvature of the EK diagram I observed that there exists a concept called as the effective mass, and this concept is directly related to the mobility of electron, right? I hope till this point it is very much clear to you. Now once you got the concept of EG and this mobility, right? So now this EG that you are seeing over here, it is directly related to your carrier concentration, right? So Ni is nothing but some constant into e to the power minus Eg by 2 kT. Correct? So there exists some intrinsic carrier concentration in the semiconductor, and you will study when you will study the MOSFET. Just a minute, somebody wants to join. Yeah, so you will study when the sir will tell you about the MOSFET, right? So this background carrier concentration that you are seeing, it is very, very dangerous. It can cause heavy leakage currents, right? And now why they are so important? Because if you look at the Apple processor, right, there will be billions of transistors. Billions of transistors will be there in the Apple processor, right? So if one transistor is having particular leakage current because of this intrinsic carrier concentration, then billions of transistors if you take, then the leakage current will be a huge, right? So that means even when your mobile is not operating, then because of the leakage current, the battery of your mobile will start to degrade, right? Your mobile will start to discharge even if you are not doing anything on your mobile, and you want to minimize this leakage current. So this will be related directly to the background intrinsic carrier concentration that you have, right? So that's how you relate. You go from the Schrodinger's equation to the Kronecker model, then you get the band diagram from the EK diagram that you have. From there on you get the concept of the effective mass, and from there on you, because of the band gap, it is directly related to the intrinsic carrier concentration. Now this is directly related to the leakage current that you will be having, and the leakage current will be directly related to the processor, because more the leakage current, then the faster the battery draining that will happen from your mobile, right? So I hope this complete flow is clear. If anybody tells you that the Schrodinger's equation and all other stuff that you studied in your BTech is complete waste, just tell them this diagram and explain it in a very depth point of view. I just told you one flow. There can exist many flows like that. When we will be studying about the MOSFETs model, the parasitics around the MOSFETs and all, right? I will take this flow and I will modify it a little bit, and I will tell it from the power amplifier point of view, right? I have one slide right now. When the time comes, I will also explain it over here. So just remember that this Schrodinger's equation is not at all useless. You are actually using it, and if this didn't even exist, you wouldn't be having this EK diagram. The band gap won't be known. Even this NI's equation won't be known, that is intrinsic carrier concentration, and this leakage current that you are seeing over here, you wouldn't have been able to predict the leakage current, and you wouldn't have been able to optimize your circuits accordingly. So I hope this complete flow is very much clear to you. If you guys have any doubts, then please feel free to ask me. So I will be moving on to the next concept now. So we will start solving the numericals. Okay. So now the first question that they are asking, just a minute. Yeah. So now the first question that they are asking is, the two possible conduction bands are shown in the E versus K diagram given over here, right? State which band will result in the heavier electron effective mass, and state the reason as well, right? So now you guys will be solving this question. I will be just writing a formula in front of you. That is, the effective mass is nothing but this h bar square, right, divided by d square E by dk square, correct? And what does this d square E by dk square means? It is nothing but the curvature. It is the curvature, right? So now can anybody please tell me which among these two curves, that is the A curve and the B curve, is having the highest curvature compared to other?
The B is having the highest curvature.
Just think again. Do you think B is having the high curvature? Okay, I will do one thing. So I will write two equations over here, right? So let's say okay, no y, E is equal to, let's say 100 times a k square, and in another case I will write E is equal to 10k square. See, these are the parabolas, right? These are the parabolas. That's why I have written the k square over here, right? So now what, at particular value of k, let's say k is equal to maybe let's say 1, right? So now this, let's say this is E1 and this is E2. So value of E1 is around 100 and value of E2 is around what? Value of E2 is around 10. So that means if I draw a vertical line, what does this vertical line denote? This vertical line tells me at particular value of k, that is the constant value of k, what will be the energy that I will be getting for these two curves, right? So now it is telling me that curve A, this will be the equation for the curve A, because for the curve A I am getting the higher energy. EA is here and this particular point EB is here, right? So that means EA is greater than EB for constant value of k, right? So that means this is the equation of the curve A, right? And this is the equation of the curve B. Now just use this d square E by dk square, and the guy who told me that the B is having the highest curvature, Now can you please tell me the answer whether the E1 or E2, whether this curve A or curve B is having the highest curvature. Let's say this is curve A and let's say this is curve B. This is the equation of the curvature. Now, just put these two equations in this formula and now just tell me which among them is having the highest curvature.
So curve is
Exactly, the curve is having the highest curvature, right? So that means the more the what you can say for particular value of k, if one of the curve is having the higher value of the energy compared to other, that means that curve is having the highest curvature. And if that particular curve is having the highest curvature, that means the electron mass will be less, that is effective mass of the electron. If for that particular semiconductor crystal who is having the EK diagram like this, it will feel that the electron is actually lighter in that particular crystal, right? The system will feel that the electron is moving very easily compared to the other part, right? So that means the curve with curve B, which is having the smaller curvature, right? So this will be facing the higher ME star value. That is, electron will be heavier in this particular semiconductor crystal compared to the crystal or semiconductor crystal whose EK diagram has been shown as a over here, right? So I hope this question is very much clear. If you guys have any doubts, please feel free to poke me at any point of time. Okay. The next question, let's see. Again, it's a completely opposite question. Somebody was trying to say something. Okay, cool. So this is exactly opposite. So in the previous part, it looks like they had given me the diagram of the conduction band, but over here they have given me the diagram of the valence band, right? So now why I have taken this question, this is seeming repetitive, right? But just note that I added one more question over here. So the question is, okay, again they are asking which one will face a heavier hole effective mass, right? And this is the second question that I have added. Which semiconductor material will you prefer to use in a high speed photodiode device? Now what is this? So let me just draw semiconductor material. So this is a slab of the semiconductor, and now what does the photodiode do? So the job of the photodiode is to convert the light energy into the electrical energy. So let's say I am shining a light from here. Now I want that whatever lights I am shining, let's say this light that you are seeing over here, let's say this light may not be of constant intensity, it may be of varying intensity. And now where is the practical application of this? So you must have at least heard about the optical fiber connections, right? So all the connections, so the internet is connected across all the world. So we have laid the optical fiber cables from the undersea, right? And now you will be having the lasers, and the lasers intensity won't be constant because laser has to contain some information. So that means if you have 0, 1, 0, 1, 1, 0, that means this is the information that you have converted from analog to digital. And if you want to transmit it, let's say from America to India, right? So now according to these bits that you are seeing over here, some parameter of the laser has to vary, and you vary the intensity according to these bits, right? So that's why I am telling you that the intensity of the light that I am shining over here, it may not be constant, it may be of the varying intensity according to the operation of the optical fiber, right? That I had just told you. Now what I want that the semiconductor material that is present over here, as soon as the intensity of the light varies over here, correspondingly I should be able to see the change in the concentration of the electrons, because if I increase the intensity, like more number of electrons from the valence band now will start jumping into the conduction band, right? So that means the amount of electrons that are free electrons that are available for the conduction, they will first of all increase. And how quickly they will increase and how quickly I will be getting this corresponding increase in the electron concentration with respect to the increasing intensity, that actually depends on how easily electron can move across this particular slab, right? So I want the electrons to move very quickly, very easily from the left to right, correct? So now the electrons where they will feel that they are very, very lighter. So if I place the same electron in a different crystal now, right? So let's say this is a semiconductor slab made up of semiconductor, maybe this curve A, and this is a semiconductor slab from the crystal B, right? So now you can clearly see that the curve A that you are seeing over here, it is having the higher curvature. That means electrons in this particular slab, electrons will feel free to move. They will not face hindrance while moving. The hindrance faced by the electrons when they are trying to move in the semiconductor slab of the crystal A, that hindrance will be very, very less compared to when the electrons try to move in the semiconductor slab which is made up of crystal B, that is shown over here, right? So I want to detect this varying intensity very, very quickly. So I want my electrons to move very, very fast, right? So now that can only happen in the material whose curvature is extremely high, so that the electrons mass is very low, effective mass of the electrons or holes are very low. By the way, I am talking about electrons over here a lot, but you can see that this diagram is actually for holes, right? So just excuse me for that. Wherever I am telling electron, just replace it with the holes, okay? So the previous diagram that I shown you, the electrons was the valid because this is a valence band, right? So the holes are the primary things that are actually giving the rise to the conduction, not the electrons, because the electrons in the valence band are tightly bound to the nucleus, and the reason we have seen in the previous slides, right? So the question is now, which semiconductor material will you prefer to use in a high-speed photodiode device? Since this is a high-speed photodiode device, right? That means the light intensity can vary extremely fast. So I want this material to detect it very quickly. So I will use a material where the holes are having the highest curvature, and the EK diagram of the particular crystal, I mean, it is having the highest curvature, so that the effective mass of the holes will be very less, and that curve is actually curve number A, right? So whenever you are solving questions from Donald Niemann or any other book, just try to relate it with the real world application. I am just telling you, behind each and every question and each and every concept written in your book, there will be some real world application behind it. It is just that you guys are not exposed to all those applications because you are in the early stages of your engineering. I was fortunate enough to come here and get exposed to all other things, and I was able to connect all other stuff, like whatever I am studying, even a one statement. Since I have a very good exposure now, I am able to relate all these things. When I was at your age, when I was studying in my BTech, even I was not able to relate these things very quickly. Only after a lot of experience I am able to relate these things now. So just take advantage of this, and please ask me any doubts if you guys have any. So we will solve one more question, and then we will take a break of 5 or 10 minutes, okay? So now again this concept of the EK diagram, right? So now let's see what they have mentioned over here. So the E versus K diagram for a particular allowed energy band is shown over here in the figure number 3.15. Again, the example has been taken from Donald Niemann book, right? Determine the sign of the effective mass, and the direction of velocity for a particle at each of the 4 positions, right? So what does this mean even? So let me just try to explain the sign of the effective mass first. So you must have studied that the m star, right? It is h square upon d square e by dk square. Correct? Now what they are asking, just tell me whether the m star value will be positive or negative. Now this is absolutely ridiculous because we have never seen a material where the mass of the electron, effective mass of the electron, will be negative, right? But there will exist a material. I don't have the material name and the diagram with me unfortunately right now, but I will, maybe in the next lecture I will come up with a material and a diagram just to tell you that there exists some materials where the mass of the electron is actually negative. This is not the actual mass, this is the effective mass of the electron. What does this mean? That means the quantum effects, when the electron is actually trying to move across multiple periodic potential wells, it is feeling as if its mass is actually negative, right? So I will come up with this, and I will come up with the appropriate slide in the next lecture, and will show you how this can happen actually, right? So now we have to just see over here, and now how can we do this? Of course we have to make some approximation for this curve, right? Again, this curve that you are seeing over here, I will be approximating it with some parabolic equation, right? With some parabolic equation, maybe E is equal to C times K square. C times K square plus some constant, maybe let's say this is C1 and this is C2. Now why did I take this constant? Because at K equal to 0, I have some finite value of energy with me, right? So if I put k is equal to 0 over here, then E will become equal to C2. If I don't take this C2 into account, that means my whatever equations I am writing, those equations will be wrong, because at k equal to 0 there exists some finite energy. That's why I have to take this constant over here, right? So now if I take this constant, if I use this equation, and if I just write d square E by dk square, right? So now this, what it will become, so you will easily find that this value will become 2 times C1. This will be 2 times C1, and now we just have to determine whether the sign of the C1 will be positive or not, right? Whether this will be positive or not. So now for, let's say, you can substitute at any point, literally at any particular time, right? Over here, maybe over here, you will always find that at any value of k, right, my E is always positive. If my E is always positive at any value of the k, that means this C1 that you are seeing over here, right? So this, just a minute, somebody wants to join. Yeah, right? So from this you can clearly tell that the value of C1 is positive, and because the C1 is positive, this curvature d square E by dk square value can't be negative for this particular EK diagram. If the d square E by dk square value can't be negative for this particular diagram, that means for this particular EK diagram, the effective mass of the electron is positive. The effective mass of the electron is positive, right? So I hope till this point it is very much clear to you. Now for the second question, it will be a little bit tricky, okay? We have been asked to find the direction of velocity for a particle at each of the 4 positions. Just a minute, again somebody wants to join. Yeah, we have been asked to find the direction of the velocity of a particle at each of this particular point. So first of all, what I have to do something, and somehow I have to bring the velocity into the equations, so that I can actually, so what do I mean? I have to somehow bring the velocity term with respect to either E, dE by dk, or d square E by dk square. If I am able to represent the velocity in either of these 3 terms, or the combination of these 3 terms, that means I have something to relate the velocity with this EK diagram, right? Maybe this velocity will be dependent on the curvature, maybe it may be dependent on the slope of the EK diagram at a particular point, or it may be directly proportional to the E also. So I have to do something, I have to play some mathematical trick, remember some formulas, and do something to represent this velocity with respect to these 3 terms that I know. Maybe some higher order derivatives or anything, I mean, okay? So now let's see how we can do, right? So now if I just write E is equal to what? H square k square by 2m. This is for a particular, this is for a free electron, right? So this is for a free electron, correct? So now what I will be doing over here, so if I just write dE by dk, right? So what it will become like h square k by m, because after taking this 2 outside, this 2 and 2 will get cancelled, right? So now again I will do one thing, I will write this h square as h into k by m. Now what did I get by writing it like this? So now let's look at this term, h into k, right? So h bar is what? H bar is nothing but h by 2 pi, and k is nothing but your momentum vector, so it is 2 pi by lambda, correct? So now if I just cancel 2 pi, so it just became like h by lambda. And can anybody tell me what is this equation h by lambda? Anyone? Exactly, very good. So this hk is nothing but your momentum, that is the p, right? And p I can write like m into v also, okay, correct? P is equal to m is valid. So now what I will be doing over here, so I will be just replacing this, somehow I have brought this velocity into by doing some mathematical tricks, I have brought velocity into picture, right? So now this thing that you are seeing over here, let me just see what if I had done anything wrong. Yeah, so this h into k, actually it became equal to p, right? So now I will put this in this equation. Let's say this is 1, let's say this is 2, from 1 and 2. So now what did I have? d by dk will be h bar into P by M. Correct? Now P I can write as M into V also. So that is h bar into P is right M into V divided by M. Correct? So this is h bar into V. This is h bar into V. Correct? So now one thing that I want to tell you guys is I have directly used this particular equation, E is equal to h square k square by 2m. Now just tell me whether this equation is valid for free electrons or whether it is valid for electrons which is bounded in a crystal. Can anybody please tell me? For free electron, exactly, right? So now, and let's look at what has been given in the question. The E versus K diagram for a particular allowed energy band is shown in the figure. So particular allowed energy band. So even if I assume that this electron is actually present in a crystal, it is present in a crystal and it is bound actually. So that means I directly could not have used this equation, right? But just to tell you, they are not asking me the magnitude. See, the direction of the velocity for a particle at each of the 4 positions. They are not asking me the magnitude. Fortunately, they are not asking me the magnitude. They are just asking me to find the direction. And how do we find the direction? So, just a minute. What has happened? Okay. Yeah. So, I have got this equation, right? d by dk is equal to h bar into v. So, I am just interested in finding out the direction, and so since h bar into v is related to the d by dk, I just have to tell them whether this d by dk is positive or negative. So only within this particular region, that is minus pi by a to pi by a, I have made approximation that this will be a continuous thing. If it is quantized, then for those particular regions, whatever I am writing, it may not be valid. It may not be valid for those particular regions if it is completely quantized. But since I am seeing over here that it is completely continuous and they have just asked me to find the direction and not the magnitude, I can rely on this equation to tell them at least the sign of the d by dk. That is the velocity, that is the direction of the velocity. I will just determine whether the d by dk at that particular point, whether it will be positive or whether it will be negative, right? So I hope it is clear. For the magnitude, this equation may not be completely valid because I am not, first of all, this electron may be bounded in the crystal, and the next thing is there may be some discontinuities that will be present over here, and those discontinuities are not taken into account using this equation. But at least you can directly tell the sign, that is how whether at that particular point whether the direction is positive or negative. So now let's look at the point number A. This is my point number A, right? So how can I tell whether the direction of velocity is positive or negative? So just a simple thing, I have to tell the derivative at that particular point, and telling the derivative at, let me write, at a point. This is nothing but drawing a tangent to the curve at that particular point, right? So I hope this is very much clear. So if I draw a tangent at this particular point A, right? So you can see the slope of the tangent is negative. The slope of the tangent is negative. Since the slope of the tangent that is negative, that means d by dk at that point is negative. That means the direction of velocity at point A is negative. Now similarly, a second exercise for you guys. So can you guys please tell me now what will happen at point number B? The slope will be negative or slope will be positive? Negative, exactly. At point B, slope will be negative. What will happen at point number C? Positive, very good. And what will happen at point number D? Positive, exactly, very good. So you guys have solved this question now. So I guess this question was taken from the exercise, that is unsolved exercise of Donald Niemann. I'm not very sure. Please just check it once. And if they had asked you to calculate the magnitude, then this would have become really difficult because you could not have made this approximation. So first of all, you would have needed the discretized information over here. Then taking this derivative would not have made sense because it's a discontinuous function, right? Then this derivative would have also become discontinuous, and you have to bring the discontinuity and functions that you had studied in your class 12 into the picture, right? But we got saved because they had just asked us to calculate whether the direction of the velocity is positive or negative, right? So guys, we will just take a break for 5 minutes and then we will move on to the next concept of the Fermi energy level. So we will be back at sharp 7:10 p.m, right? Okay. We have resumed the recording now. Just a moment. Yeah, so now the next concept that sir must have told you in the week 2 is about the Fermi energy level, right? So the first thing that you should understand that the Fermi energy level, it is not a real concept, right? It is not a real concept, so we have made it to fit our understanding. So if you try to measure the Fermi energy level using the real world experiments and all, so the Fermi energy level, it's not a real level that is actually existing. So we have deliberately made it to fit our understanding, right? So now the first thing that you will understand, that the Fermi energy level, in most of the books it will be written that it's a, somebody wants to join, okay, so it will be a statistical construct or it will be a statistical distribution, right? So now it is just telling you that the probability of finding the electron, right? So it is nothing but, so if you just take the conduction band EC, EV, right, somewhere in the middle, somewhere near the middle, your EF will be lying. So now it is telling you what? So if you look at the EF over here, now it is telling you that this is the level where you will find that the 50% of the you will be finding that the probability of electron to find at this level will be around 50%. Now the first question that I will be asking you is, okay, you have studied the Fermi distribution and all, so the Fermi distribution formula that you must have seen in the lecture has been written over here, right? So now at E is equal to EF, so you can clearly see, if I just substitute E is equal to EF, what you will get in from this formula, 1 upon 1 plus, since E minus EF will become 0, this will become 1. So you will see that this probability exactly will be 50%. Now can anybody please tell me whether there exists any electron in the band gap or there cannot exist any electron in the band gap? Can anyone please tell me? I am telling you that this region that you are seeing over here, this is the forbidden energy gap, forbidden band gap, forbidden gap, right? So what do the word forbidden means? Cannot exist, exactly. Forbidden means cannot exist. Electron cannot exist in this region. But what does this statistical distribution, that is this statistical construct, is telling us? That hey, there is a 50% probability that you can find an electron in between also. So now somewhere there must be something you can say na ki dal mein kuch kala hai, right? So something must be happening somewhere, that one thing is telling me that there cannot exist electron, and other stuff is telling me that there exists a 50% probability that electron can exist at that particular level. So there is a missing piece in the puzzle that we may not have seen completely, or sir must have told you, just given you a hint that there exists something like that, and that is why this puzzle that we have. So is this something which will help us to solve this puzzle. And what does this mean? So this puzzle, that the thing, that the missing piece of the puzzle is nothing but the density of states. So what it is actually telling, so this blue curve that you are seeing over here, by the way, I have not given the reference, so the reference is again the Donald Niemann book, okay, Donald Niemann. So now this diagram that you are, this blue curve that you are seeing, this is the distribution, that this is the Fermi direct distribution, and this curve, this black curve that you are seeing, actually it is nothing but the density of states. So density of states is nothing but, actually we are telling, okay, there are so many states that are actually existing over here, and among these states electron can occupy any one of them. So this is nothing but the density of states, and as you move away from EC, you can see that this density of states is actually increasing, and as you move away from EV, that is at the down energy level, this density of states is again increasing. But if you see in the middle over here, you can see that there is the density of states is completely zero. Density of states is ending at this point, it is ending at this point, but there is no density of states present in between. So now to calculate the concentration of electrons, you actually take the product of this density of states into the Fermi direct distribution, because it is nothing but the game of the permutation and combinations, right? You must have studied in class 11th and 12th. So the probability that the electron finding the electron, the probability that electron exists at this particular energy level, into the multiplying it by the number of total states that are actually available, will give us the concentration of electrons. So you can see that the electron concentration peaks over here, right? again if you see the whole concentration peaks somewhere here, but there is no concentration that exists in between. So if somebody tries to fool you that hey, just see in between, that is in the forbidden gap, there exists a probability to find the electron, but the textbook is telling that there cannot exist any electron in between, then the missing piece in the puzzle is the density of states. Only when you multiply these two things, the density of states and the Fermi-Dirac distribution, you will get the concentration of electrons and holes, and as you can see, there is no concentration that is present in this region, right? So I hope this point is clear to you, because this was one of the biggest confusion that I had in my BTech. So you guys should not suffer, since I had already suffered in my BTech. So now then we will look into the next concept, that is the variation with the temperature. So now the first thing is, I am seeing that how the Fermi level, that is the difference between EF minus EI. What is the EI? So let me just point over here. So this is EC, this is EV, right? So there will be some Fermi level that will be present over here, and there is an intrinsic Fermi level, EFI, right? So now if you increase the doping, right, if you increase, let's say if you increase the doping of n-type dopants, right, if you inserted a lot of n-type dopants, then this Fermi level that you are seeing over here, only and only this Fermi level will move up, EFI will never move up in this case, right? And so what will happen, the difference between EF and EFI that you are seeing over here, it will actually increase with the doping, and this is what this equation is telling you. As I increase my doping ND, that this EF minus EI difference will increase, because EF is moving up and EI is remaining at constant place, right? So I hope this point is clear to you. Now I just want to ask one question to you guys. Is this curve very much clear to you? Why this why the EF minus EFI is actually decreasing with the temperature, whereas the T is directly, where you can see over here, EF minus EI is directly proportional to T. It is in the multiplication factor over here, and despite that, the slope that you are seeing over here, it is negative. So are you guys clear about this, why this stuff is actually happening, why this EF minus EFI is actually having a negative slope despite having the T term over at the outside? So are you guys clear about it, or do you want me to explain it in a few minutes? Explain. Okay. So now we will start breaking this thing down. Okay. So EF minus EI is what? KT ln ND by Ni. Now I am already assuming that all the dopants that I have inserted in my intrinsic semiconductor, they all are ionized. Or ionized means whatever electrons they have brought, so that electron was able to move itself into the conduction band, and everything is completely ionized, right? So now what? So now we first have to think what are the terms in this equation which are dependent on the temperature, right? So the first thing that you are seeing over here, this is my first term, right? ND does not depend on the temperature as of now, because I am assuming a complete ionization case, because we are operating at 200-300 Kelvin temperature. This much, at this particular temperature, the ionization energy, I mean we have to cross that ionization energy barrier for those dopant electrons to move into the conduction band, right? So at this particular temperature, enough energy will be given to those electrons that they move into the conduction, right? Now the only thing, this Ni thing that you are seeing over here, only this term is remaining now. Now you must have seen that Ni is nothing but root of NCNV into exponential of E minus Eg by 2 kT. You must have seen this formula, and I am sure sir must have taken it, right? So now first of all, we have to see this, how this thing is actually varying up, right? So now if I just take the log over here, log of Ni, right? So there will be some constant that I will be getting, some constant because of this C, and then if I take the log of exponential, then this entire bracket will come outside, that is C minus Eg by 2 kT, right? C minus Eg by 2 kT. Now what I will do, EF minus EI will be what? K into T. Now this log term that I have taken over here, so I will put it over here now. So log of ND will be over here minus ln Ni. So this, so minus of this term, I will insert it in the equation, minus of this term, right? So minus C plus Eg by 2 kT. So this is the term that I have with me right now, correct? So now if I just try to solve it, right? So now this KT and this KT and this KT I will cancel up. So this will become like Eg by 2, and then what I will be left with? I will be left with ln of Nd minus C, and by the way this is not the minus, this is plus, yeah, and I will be left with plus KT into this term, right? Now I will just leave this as a homework to you guys. Just calculate the sign of this term, okay? I'm not asking you to calculate the magnitude, just calculate the sign of this term. The sign of this term will come out to be negative. The sign of this term will come out to be negative. On one hand you have Nd over here, and this C is nothing but the log of root of Nc into Nv. So just calculate it, use the formula of Nc and Nv from Donald Newman's book or from the lecture material that has been provided to you in the week 2, and just calculate the sign of this term. This sign will come negative, and if this sign comes up negative, right, then what it will become like? Eg by 2 minus some constant C into KT, right? So this is what we got. Eg by 2 minus C times KT, and because of this minus C into KT term that you are seeing over here, that is why this slope is actually decreasing. So that's why even if I increase the temperature, despite the fact that the T term is directly available over here, there is a hidden T term present in the equation of the intrinsic carrier concentration that is actually causing this what you can say Eg by 2 and some slope, that is some constant that will come outside, and because of this minus C into KT you are getting this negative slope actually. So I hope now this concept is very much clear to you and you guys won't be confused at all with this concept. So now let's move on to solve few questions, right? And because we want to get some feel for the numbers, and after that we will move on to the concept of drift current and the mobility, where I will explain you how the mobility is so important in the practical applications of the circuits, right? So now let's look into this question number 4. So now they are asking us to calculate the probability that an energy state above EF is occupied by an electron, right? So they have given the temperature of 300 Kelvin. Determine the probability that an energy level 3 kT above Fermi energy is occupied by an electron, right? So they are just asking me the probability. So what I will write? I will just write the formula, right? F of E. So what is the formula? 1 upon 1 plus exponential E minus EF by KT. E minus EF by KT. The probability at a particular energy level. The probability at a particular energy level. And what is that energy level? That energy level is 3 kT above my Fermi energy level, right? So from that statement I have written this equation. Now I will just put, just a minute, I will just put this equation over here and let's see what we will get. F of E is nothing but 1 upon 1 plus exponential E minus EF will be what? 3 kT. 3 kT divided by kT. So this became like exponential cube. 1 upon 1 plus E cube. Right? So if you solve this, what will be the value of E cube by the way? So if you just use a calci, then I guess this E cube comes out to be something like 20.09. 20.09. And if you calculate this probability, so now if you just solve it, then this will become like 0.047. So the probability, you have to multiply it by 100. So this becomes like 4.7%. Right? So what does this actually telling you? So it is actually telling you that the probability that electron will exist at 3 kT above the Fermi energy level, right? It is hardly 4.7%. And just to give you an intuitive understanding of this, so this is the EC, this is the EV, this is the EF. This is the EF, right? This is the place where there is a 50% probability of finding an electron, right? So this is the place where there is a, just a minute, 50% probability of finding an electron. Now as I move down, this probability increases. As I move up, this probability, what happens to this probability? This probability actually decreases, right? So I am moving 3 kT above this EF. So I must have reached somewhere here, right? So intuitively this probability should drop from 50%, and we got the answer that the probability has actually dropped from 50% to the 4.7%. So intuitively this answer actually makes sense. If I had got an answer like 60 or 70%, then I would have clearly known that I had done some calculation mistake, because this cannot be correct answer. The probability should always decrease if I am moving above the EF, right? So this is just a sanity check that you can perform just to check whether your answers are correct or not, right? So now this fourth question we have already taken. Now let's move on to the next question. That is the question number 5. So the one part of this question will be left as a homework to you. So just follow this question very carefully if you want to get the answer for the other part, right? So again, I guess this question has been taken from the unsolved problem of the Donald Niemann. So now consider the energy level shown in the figure 3.42. So and the temperature has been given as 300 Kelvin. If the E1 minus EF, note that they have not denoted it as a conduction or valence band, they have just given it as an energy level, right? So this value E1 minus EF has been given as 0.3 eV. So now determine the probability that an energy state at E is equal to E1 is occupied by an electron, and the probability that an energy state at E is equal to E2 is empty. So now I will just write for the formula first, right? F of E is what? 1 upon 1 plus exponential of E minus EF by KT. See, this is the number, probability number, right? Now what is this probability? Probability that electron is present at this particular energy state, right? It is nothing but the occupation probability. I can write it like that, right? Occupation probability of electron. Now this is the occupation probability. So if you have been asked to calculate the empty probability, that is the state will not be occupied by the electron, then from your class 11th and 12th probability principle, this will be nothing but 1 minus F of E. 1 minus F of E is what? State is empty. This was the only trick in the question. That's it. Rest of the question is exactly same. So now let's try to calculate. So they are asking me that E is equal to E1 is occupied, right? So that means I have to calculate F of E1. 1 upon 1 plus exponential, what I will get? E1 minus EF, right? So I need to first calculate the value of E1 minus EF. E1 minus EF is this term that has been given as 0.3 electron volts to me. 0.3 electron volts, right? So now this will be like 0.3 electron volts. And now what will be the value of KT, right? So now at room temperature, that is 300 Kelvin, you can assume the KT to be around 26 milli electron volt, right? Approximately you can do that. If they want an exact answer, then you have to take that Boltzmann constant and multiply it with the temperature and all, right? So and you have to also remember that this number will be in electron volts, and if you multiply it with the Boltzmann constant, that is 1.38 into 10 to the power minus 23, and the temperature, then you also have to multiply this EV. You have to convert it into a normal quantity, right? So 1 electron volt is nothing but you have to multiply by this 1.6 into 10 to the power 19 as well. So just to avoid that lengthy calculation, you can assume a 26 milli electron volt for the particular KT. So if you calculate this value, right, if you calculate it, then the value of F of E1 that you will get, I guess you will get something like 9.2 into 10 to the power minus 6, right? So this is the F of E1. If you calculate it in percentage, then the percentage you have to multiply it by 100 only. Yeah. So this is not in percentage, this is in the linear. So if you multiply it by the 100, then this will be 9.2 into 10 to the power minus 4 percentage, right? It is extremely low. It is extremely low, right? So they are just telling you that if you move 0.3 electron volt above this Fermi level, then the probability is almost what? Almost close to 0. So just to give you a rough idea of how this number came up actually. So now this 3 KT that you are seeing over here, so this 3 KT corresponds to what? 26 milli electron volt into 3, right? So this is 78 milli electron volts. 78 milli electron volts. So if I try to write this number in a normal mode, I have to divide it by 1000, right? So this will become like 0.078 electron volt, right? So when I moved up from the Fermi level by 0.078 electron volts, my probability of occupation of the electron got reduced from 50% to 4.7%. Now how much distance I am moving? Instead of moving 0.078 electron volts, I am actually moving 0.3 electron volt. This is very higher compared to this term, right? So now the probability of occupation should even reduce compared to the last answer that I got. What was the last answer? 4.7%, right? And from that 4.7%, now I have reduced to 9.2 into 10 to the power minus 4%. It is very close to 0, right? So even this answer is actually making sense, that if I moved so quickly, if I moved by such a huge distance from the EF, right, then the probability should decrease exponentially, and indeed it has decreased exponentially, right? So this is another way how you can do a sanity check on your answer, right? So now the next question is the probability that an energy state at E is equal to E2 is empty. So first of all, I have to calculate f of E2, right? And then I have to subtract it with the 1 to get my final answer, right? So now let me calculate f of E2. For that, I have to know the answer of E2 minus EF as well, right? And what is the value of E2 minus EF they have given? Let me just check. So see, E2 minus EF has not directly been given to me, but E1 minus EF has been given, right? E1 minus EF is 0.3 electron volt. So EF minus E2 must be 1.12 electron volt minus 0.3 electron volts, right? So I got this, correct? So now this answer that you're seeing over here, so E2 minus EF will come out to be something like 0.82 electron volts. And this is not E2 minus EF, this is EF minus E2. Okay, so E2 minus EF will be negative of this number. So 1 upon 1 plus exponential E2 minus EF will be minus 0.82 electron volts, and this is 26 milli electron volts, right? So now if you calculate the answer to this particular question, right? So if you try to calculate it, then this number that you are seeing over here, this number will be approximately close to 1 only. F of E2 came out to be 1. And now we have to find out the reason why f of E2 came out to be 1. So if I move below Fermi level, then the probability of occupation of electron actually increases from 50% to 100% at the EV level, right? It will increase to some different value, not exactly 100%, but very, very close to 100%, right? So now I am moving 0.82 electron volts from the Fermi level. Initially, I had moved only 0.3 electron volt from the Fermi level above, and my probability almost reduced to 0. Probability of occupation almost reduced to 0. Oh, just a minute. Oh yeah, so if I move almost a triple distance of this 0.3 electron volt, of course I am expecting that I should get the other answer, that is the probability of occupation should reach close to 100%, right? And that is why this answer makes sense, that why I got the probability of occupation of that particular state by the electron as 1, and that's why 1 minus f of E2, this answer will reduce down to 0. I hope this is very much clear to you. So this is the way you have to solve all the Fermi energy questions. Nothing, some trick will be given to you that like some of the energy, some of the difference will not be given to you, some difference will be given to you. So you have to play in between, and just don't get confused between the probability of the energy state being empty or occupied. So empty means 1 minus f of E, occupation means f of E. I hope that is very much clear to you. So if you guys have any doubts, then please feel free to poke me at any point. So what I will be doing, I will be jumping on to the question number 7 directly. This I will leave as a homework for you. Just a minute. I will leave as a homework for you because of the lack of time. And this is not an unsolved example. This example has been solved in the Donald Niemann. So just go through this example, and if you have any doubts, then please come to me in the next lecture. We will try to solve it together. Yeah. So now let's look at the question number 7, right? So now they are asking silicon at T is equal to 300 Kelvin is doped with arsenic atoms. Arsenic are nothing but the N-type dopants. They are N-type. So they will make your semiconductor N-type because they are donating the electrons, right? Such that the concentration of electrons is N0 is equal to 7 into 10 to the power 15 per centimeter cube. The position of the Fermi level with respect to EC and EFI, right? So now I have to just do first thing, I have to remember a formula which can tell me this thing, EC minus EF and EF minus EFI. The moment I am able to find these two formulas, my job becomes easier. So from the lecture materials and from the sir's lecture, he must have told you this formula that EC minus EF is nothing but KT ln NC divided by N0. N0, right? And EF minus EI, we have already seen it, right? KT ln of ND divided by NI. This is what we have seen till now. Correct? So now I just need to check. Let me write it as equation number 1. Let me write it as equation number 2. I just have to check whether I know each and every term on the right side. K value is known to me. KT has been given to me. The value of NC is also fortunately given to me. And what is this? This is the concentration of the dopant, right? So the concentration of the dopant, that is the electron concentration, is also directly given to me. So I can directly substitute and I can directly get the value of EC minus EF, right? So I will just write it 0.025 into ln of NC has been given at 7 into 10 to the power 15. What is the value of no, sorry, just a minute. I will just write a negative term over here because I have flipped the denominator and numerator. So if I just cross it, it will become very bad drawing. So I am just writing a negative sign over here and I have flipped it actually. This denominator became numerator, numerator became denominator. Okay. So 7 into 10 to the power 15. And what is the other term? The NC value. The NC value has been given as 2.8 into 10 to the power 19. Correct? So if you just solve this equation, EC minus EF, right? So you will get it as 0.207 electron volts. So this is the first question, answer of the first part that we got. Now let's move on to the equation number 2, right? So from equation number 2, right? So EF minus EI, correct, will be what? 0.025 into ln of ND by NI. What is the value of ND? So ND is nothing but the dopant concentration, 7 into 10 to the power 15. What is the value of NI? It is a intrinsic carrier concentration for the silicon, 1.5 into 10 to the power 10. So the value of EF minus EI that you will be getting, it will be very close to, I guess, 0.326 electron volts, right? So I have to find these numbers. One is 0.207, another one is 0.326, right? So the Fermi level, right? So the just a minute. So the Fermi level is just 0.207 electron volts below my conduction band, 0.207 electron volts below my conduction band, and it is 0.326 electron volts above my EFI, because EF minus EFI difference is positive, right? So that means Fermi level must be above intrinsic Fermi level by 0.326 electron volts, right? So that means this option is perfectly matching our answers. So this is the correct answer, right? If you guys have any doubts, then please feel free to poke me at any point, okay? So now we will move on to the next part of the presentation, that is the drift current and the related concepts, right? So now we will do one thing. We will just have a good challenging question now. So now the task has been given to you. So this slab one is there. It is one semiconductor slab, right? And this is another semiconductor slab. So these two slabs have been given to you, and you have been tasked to find the mobility of a given semiconductor slab. So that means you have to do something. You have to take these two semiconductor slabs in your lab. You have to do something. You have to do some experiments. And how will you construct the experiments? We have to remember the concepts that we have studied in the drift currents, right? So what happens when you apply voltage across a semiconductor slab, like drift current flows and all, right? So you must have studied about it. You must have also studied about the formulas of the resistivity, conductivity of a given semiconductor slab, right? Depending on whether the semiconductor is a compensated semiconductor, whether it's a N-type dope or whether it's a P-type dope. So all of this you must have studied in the lecture, right? So now we have been given this task that two slabs have been given to me, and they are asking me to determine the mobility of these two slabs, right? And also some interesting things have been given to me. So they have told me that one of the slab has a P-type doping while other has a N-type doping. The doping is completely uniform and the concentration of the doping is known, and it is same for both the slabs. That means if I have, let's say this is the N-type slab, so whatever concentration ND I have over here, and let's say this is a P-type slab, right? So the concentration of the acceptor atoms are Na. So they have given that ND is equal to Na. Correct? So now the next thing that they have given, design an experiment to determine the mobility of both the slabs, right? Can you differentiate between the P-type and the N-type slab? Okay. So now this is a very good and challenging question. So let's see how we can solve the question, right? So first of all, I have to design some experiments. Without doing something I cannot determine. whether what are the mobilities and which of the slides are actually which of the slabs are actually doped with the N type or P type, right? So now I can do one thing. Let's say this is my slab. Let's say this is my one semiconductor slab. Now if I apply a voltage across it, right? If I apply a voltage across this particular semiconductor slab, then what is going to happen? Sir must have clearly told you that there is a drift current that flows through the slab, right? And depending on how much this slab has been doped N type or P type, I will be getting the resistance of this slab, which will be nothing but V by I from the Ohm's law, right? This is nothing but the V by I by the Ohm's law, correct? So now first of all, I can find the resistance of this slab by doing the experiments. I can apply a battery across this slab, and using the ammeter, I can just measure the current, right? I can just measure the current that will be flowing through this circuit. From this, I know the value of the resistance. Now I have to do something. I have to write few equations, and I have to make sure that this resistance comes in terms of the mobility, right? So now what I know, R is nothing but rho into L by A. So this is the formula that you must have studied from your school, right? And now somehow I have to bring mobility in this equation, right? So now L is independent of mobility, area is independent of mobility. What about this rho? Rho is nothing but the resistivity of this semiconductor material, and rho is nothing but 1 upon sigma, that is the conductivity, right? And do I know the formula for the conductivity of the semiconductor? Of course I know. It is nothing but Q into N mu N plus P mu P, correct? Now, but for a particular slab, let's say I am taking only one slab, I know that let's say this slab is N type dope. This is N type dope, like I am taking only one of the two slabs. So that means I am making this term 0 because N times mu N will be much greater than P times mu P. So I have done one thing, I have brought the resistivity in terms of the conductivity over here, right? And now this is the equation number 1. This is the equation number 2. What I wanted to relate the mobility somehow with the resistance, because this is the experiment that I had done, correct? So now let me substitute, let me write from 1 and 2. From 1 and 2, R is nothing but 1 upon Q N mu N, just a minute, Q N mu N, correct, into L upon A. So what will the mobility be? Mobility will be what? Mu N will be L upon Q times N times R times A, correct? So this is for the particular slab. Now similarly, for other slab, I can write mu P is equal to what? L times Q into P into R into A. P is nothing but the concentration of acceptor atoms that I am doping the semiconductor with, right? So this is how I got the two equations now. So first of all, I have done one thing. I have constructed a simple experiment to get the value of the resistance of the semiconductor slab. Then I use my high school physics formula of the R is equal to rho into L by A. Then I use the formula that sir had taught, that is rho, not this one, sir had taught the equation number 2, right? Rho is nothing but 1 upon Qn into mu n. And from there on, I calculated the equations, that is the mobility in terms of the resistance. Now let me check whether I know all the stuff or not, right? See, the dimensions of the slabs have been given to me. The dimensions of the slab, that is L and A, have been given to me. The doping has been given to me. The charge, this is 1.6 into 10 to the power minus 19. I know this, right? And the resistance, do I know the resistance of the slab? Of course I know, because I constructed an experiment to determine the resistance. So I know all the terms in this equation now. And also similarly for other, that is mu P equation, I know all the terms that are present on the right hand side, right? Since I know all these terms, I can actually calculate the mobility of two slabs. The only thing that you should know is that even though I have written the equations, I don't know which slab has been doped with the N-type semiconductor and which slab has been doped with the P-type dopant. P-type dopant and N-type dopant, right? So I will get two values of the mobility. I will get one mu slab 1. I will get mu into slab 2. Now if you just compare, compare these two stuffs, right? So now you will be getting the mobility. And now first thing that you should note that in slab 1, the majority carrier may be electrons. In slab 2, majority of the carriers will be holes, right? Now this is the question for you guys. Can you guys tell me now which mobility should be higher, mobility of slab 2 or mobility of the slab 1? Which mobility will be higher? Slab 1, exactly right. So because the electrons have a higher mobility than the holes, so the mobility of the slab 1 should be higher than the mobility of the slab 2. So what was the conclusion of doing all this? So you just conduct this experiment, you get the resistance of the slabs, you find the values of the two mobilities, and these two mobilities values will not be same because the majority carriers present in those two slabs are actually different. In one case the electrons are the majority carriers, in another case holes are the majority carriers, right? So in whatever slab you will get the higher mobility, you know that this slab is actually nothing but a n-type semiconductor, and the slab whose mobility comes out to be lower, this is nothing but the p-type semiconductor. Correct? So I hope this is exactly clear to you how you can find the mobility by constructing some very rudimentary experiment, and how you can differentiate between the two slabs whether they have been p-type doped or n-type doped. Now the reason why I did this in front of you is because I will be giving a homework to you guys, and the homework will be nothing but this question. See, again what they are asking, a silicon sample, this is the length of the semiconductor given, a cross sectional area of the semiconductor A, this is A has been given, silicon is the n type with the donor impurity concentration Nd has been also given to you, the resistance of the sample is measured and found to be 70 ohms, right? Find the electron mobility. So I will do one thing, I will just take this formula, right? I will just take this formula, Un is equal to what? L upon Q times N times R times A. Everything has been given to you. L is given, A is given, R is given, concentration is given, Q is also given to you. So can you find mobility from over here? Of course you can find, right? So this will be a homework for you guys because I have explained the concept to you. So just use this formula and just solve the value for this. You should get the answer. Let me just check what should be the answer. So the answer that you should be getting is this 1001. Just a minute. What happened to my pen? Yeah, 1116.1 centimeter square per volt second. So this is the answer that you should be getting. So just use this formula and substitute everything, right? So now one more thing, that is there are two more things that are actually remaining. So this will take just 8 or 10 minutes. So the first thing, can you guys please tell me why the electron is actually having a higher mobility than the holes? Sir must have told you this, right? Why the mobility of electron is actually higher than the holes? You guys can unmute, because if you try to type in the chat section, maybe it will become too long. Till the point you guys answer, let me just draw a quick figure for you. Yeah. Can anybody please explain? Anybody, any answer is fine. Even if you guess, that is okay. I don't have. Hole has a higher mass. Very good. Now the next question I will ask you is why the holes have a higher mass? Why the MH star is greater than ME star? I will just ask you one question. See, very good, you answered. I will just give you one hint. So can you tell me whether the, see, this is a nucleus, right? I'm just drawing it for the demonstration. These are not circular orbitals, okay? So now, can you just tell me which electrons are tightly bound to the nucleus? This is electron 1. This is electron 2, right? And which electrons takes part in the conduction? Electrons which are tightly bound to the nucleus, they are present, they will take part in the conduction, or electrons which are loosely bound, they will take part in the conduction? Loosely bound, exactly, right? So electron 1 is a loosely bound electron, correct? So now the electrons, so whatever electrons are present in the conduction band, like they are extremely loosely bound electrons, they are free, I mean, right? If you look at these particular electrons, correct, they are not taking part in your conduction. They are, if they are not taking part in your conduction, that means they must be present in the inner shells, right? They must be present in the inner shells. So those electrons are actually experiencing a higher tighting force from the nucleus. And what do you mean by even holes? See, this is the electron, this is the electron, this is the empty state. I'm talking about the valence band over here, right? So when this electron actually moves into this empty state, then the next state will become something like this: electron, empty state, electron. So what has actually happened, instead of telling that electron has moved from here to here, I can similarly tell that actually hole has moved from the right side to the left side, correct? So that means the movement of holes is occurring in place which is very near to the nucleus, right? So I will repeat again, the movement of the hole is actually occurring at such a place which is very nearby to the nucleus compared to electrons which are in the conduction band, because they are very loosely bound, right? So if the movement is actually experiencing a hindrance because of the tightening force from the nucleus, right? So that means this electron will face a hindrance in free moving, right? So that means what will be the next state now? So the next state will be, this electron will jump over here, this hole will be looking something like this, correct? So but how this process is actually happening, this hole is actually being dragged, this whole movement is actually being dragged by the force from the nucleus, by the force from the nucleus. And this force is actually very less for this electron in the conduction band because it is loosely bound. Because of the force, because the holes are moving very closer to the nucleus compared to the free electrons which are moving in the shells which are very loosely bound, right? So that is why the effective mass of the hole comes out to be greater compared to the effective mass of the electron, right? The first answer that the girl gave, it was correct, that the effective mass of the hole is greater than electron. That's why the electron mobility is actually higher than the holes. But if I ask another question, that is why the effective mass of the hole is greater than that of the electron, then you should remember that the holes are actually moving to the shells or orbitals or shells, whatever you call. The shells are nothing but actually your K, L, M, N. These are your shells, right? So the number that you see, 1s2, 2s2, 2p6. So these numbers 2 and 1, these are actually your shells, right? And within the shells, if you observe, then you will be having your orbitals, that is the 2px, 2py, 2pz orbitals. So these orbitals are placed actually closer to the nucleus where the holes are moving, so that's why they are experiencing the tightening force. Because of that tightening force, they are not able to move freely. Because they are not able to move freely, that's why the effective mass of the hole is greater than electron. I hope this point is very much clear to you. So if you guys have any doubts, then please feel free to poke me, because I will be moving on to a very important part now, that is the practical application of the mobility. Why are we even studying this effective mass of the electron, effective mass of the hole? These are looking like a quantum mechanical phenomenon, right? Why I am even interested in the mobility and the effective mass of the electron. So let's look at the very major application, that is the power amplifier. Now what is the power amplifier? So power amplifier is nothing but the circuitry that is present in your mobile just before the antenna, and its job is to pump enough power from your mobile so that it reaches the base station, right? It reaches the base station, and wherever you are calling, your call will be routed through the base station only, right? So wherever you are standing, your mobile has to make sure that it is pumping out sufficient power that the signal reaches the base station, and for that we need a power amplifier, right? So now if you look, I told you, right, I told you about the automotive radar in the last slide. In the last lecture, I told you about automotive radars. So they operate at 77 gigahertz. If you talk about the 5G bands, new 5G millimeter wave bands, right, they are present around 28 gigahertz, right? They are present around 28 gigahertz. Now you will see that these power amplifiers, even if you open your mobile, you will find that these power amplifiers will be made up of gallium arsenide, gallium nitride, or indium phosphide material. You will never find that these are made up of silicon. And especially if you move to the millimeter wave, right, then almost I can say that out of whatever power amplifiers exist in whatever commercial devices, most of them would have been made up of this gallium arsenide, indium phosphide, or gallium nitride. Now why is it the case? Because if you observe, just go back to the lecture material and just compare the mobility of electrons for silicon, gallium arsenide and indium phosphide. I am sure in the lecture material sir must have given you the mobility of silicon and the gallium arsenide, right? So you will observe that the mobility of the electron in the gallium arsenide material, it is much higher than the mobility of electron that is present in the silicon. Now what I told you, the mobility is nothing but the ease with which electron can move in the semiconductor crystal, right? Now what are these high frequencies? What does this high frequency actually means? That means if I take a semiconductor slab, I am actually applying a 60 gigahertz signal over here. I am actually applying a 60 gigahertz signal over here, and this is my semiconductor slab. Now this is not a correct representation because I should have taken a MOSFET. But since you guys are not very familiar with the MOSFET, right? So this is the gate where actually I am applying a 60 gigahertz signal, right? So the carriers that are actually building up this MOSFET, or if you look into the semiconductor slab, whatever change I am actually applying, I want my electrons present inside the semiconductor slab to react very quickly, that is instantaneously. Even if I apply 60 gigahertz or 100 gigahertz signal, this electron should be able to respond to such a high frequency. That means, first of all, for that thing to happen, electrons should not face a hindrance from the crystal while it is moving from the one end of the slab to another end, right? And that can only happen in the crystal where the mass of the electron, effective mass of the electron, is very low. And that can only happen in the materials where the curvature of the EK diagram is extremely higher, right? So from the curvature of the EK diagram, now I am actually relating the stuff to the power amplifier. So if I want to make the power amplifier which is working at a 77 gigahertz, let's say I want to design a power amplifier that will go into the radar of your car, right? So now I have to make sure that the material that I choose, the electron is able to move very speedily compared to other materials, right? And that is one of the reasons why the gallium arsenide was chosen. This is only one of the reasons, okay? Efficiency, the power density, these are the two different reasons that we will look maybe in the towards the end of the course, right? But right now you should note that the mobility is one of the reasons why the gallium arsenide was chosen over the silicon, because the way with which electron actually moves in the gallium arsenide, it does not face a lot of hindrance compared to the way with which it moves in the silicon. And the more quickly electron is able to react, the higher the frequency I can stretch up, use this for, the higher the frequency I can apply across this semiconductor slab, right? That means it can react instantaneously to any change that I am actually applying over here. That is the reason why, if you look in over these terms, there are some terms called as maximum frequency of oscillation of the transistor and the transit frequency of the oscillator. You will always find that the Fmax and Ft numbers for the gallium arsenide are always higher compared to the silicon. And this is one of the main reasons that the mobility is extremely high in the gallium arsenide compared to silicon. So I hope it is very much clear to you that you will not doubt why this mobility and effective mass of the electrons are so important for circuit designers like me, because we choose the materials accordingly. And that is why you can see new materials are coming up, like gallium nitride. Some other research is also going on some other materials, because just look at this indium phosphide, at how much higher frequency it can operate compared to this silicon, right? So I hope you will not doubt why you are studying the mobility, EK diagram, the effective mass of the electron and all, because this is where ultimately it is getting used, and you will be getting very much familiar with this as you move ahead in your BTech. And if you really want to dive deep into it, then you have to do the masters, unless until you won't be able to understand everything, okay? So just because I am into the PhD, I have been exposed to all those fields, so that's why I am able to connect all the dots. Even if you enter into the PhD, then you will be able to do the same thing. Okay, so this was the last question, and this was the last important concept for today that I wanted you to explain. So if you guys have any doubts, then please feel free to poke me. The time is now 8 p.m. so we are almost done with this time. So do you guys have any doubts? Were you able to understand why are you studying the effective mass, EK diagram, mobility and all? Do you still find that those concepts are useless to you? were you able to at least relate why are you even studying the effective mass and the mobility? Was this clear to you by giving this example? Okay, great. Okay. So, guys, just we will just stay here for 1 or 2 more minutes. If you guys have any doubts, then you can answer. Sorry, you can ask, or else we will just leave after 1 or 2 minutes. Last call. Any doubts, guys? Okay, great. It seems everything is clear. If you guys have any doubts, then please feel free to ask in the forum, or you can bring back your doubts in the next lecture as well. So thank you all of you for staying here for 2 hours. Have a nice evening ahead, and take care. Good night. Enjoy your weekend. Thank you.